So today's lecture features Larry Kramer, president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and Larry became president of the foundation in September 2012. And I will just say that I had the opportunity when I was doing some research about what foundations are doing around a number of issues in this area of promoting civil discourse and conversations and that type of thing. And I ran across what the Hewlett Foundation was doing with Larry's direction, and I was just amazed. So I sent a note to Faith and I said, can we invite him to talk to us? I was so excited, and he accepted. So I'm thrilled that we have him here today. The Hewlett Foundation's $50 million Madison Initiative is a bold effort to tackle the problem of political polarization with a special focus on the U.S. Congress. And of course, it's kind of fitting this week that he's here, although I don't know how he's going to feel about talking after our elections. But he will discuss the initiative and the role of philanthropy in moving policy processes, and we will also have some time for Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Larry to the podium.
Thank you to Billie and to Faith for inviting me, and to Lauren for inspiring this. Whoever funded it, thank you, and all of you as well. I have notes. I just should tell you, I don't know how many lawyers there are out there. When I was at Stanford, there's a faculty member named Barbara Babcock, who is the best speaker I've ever seen. And early on in my deanship, she came and saw me speak, and she came up to me afterwards, and she said, you know, if you have just some advice, if you have a choice between speaking from the heart and speaking from notes, speak from notes. She uses them herself. So I'll just talk for a few minutes, try and set the stage, and explain a little bit about what we're doing, and then try and get to Q&A with all of you as quickly as possible, because that's really where it's more interesting. You know, just again, by way of background, it's worth thinking a little bit about sort of traditional charity and what philanthropy was up through the middle of the 20th century or so. You know, when you have a world in which there's really very limited government, very limited social services, the chief role charity played was direct services. Right, provide in the community through direct support, and most of it was done at the community level with local institutions, as compared to the modern world in which we have much larger populations with much greater needs, a more pervasive social safety net that essentially people understand is necessary, and because of populations can't be supplied in the local community, and instead, you know, requires government action and support. And you know, if you think about something like, say, education, think of 19th century education and 20th century education, and you see that shift there. Now, the role of government varies hugely, both within fields and across fields. So you do have full government provision of services in some areas, but even in other areas, you know, you may have public-private partnerships, you may have government regulation of a private sector, but one way or another, the role of government is pretty pervasive. And that point is the same then no matter what field you're working in, right? Just government today has a profound and necessary role in all of our lives. And I also want to note that's true whether you're on the left or the right. One of the things that I find really remarkable, the rhetoric of politics today sometimes is framed as if, you know, you have this right conservative that forces that believe no government is better than any government, and it's not actually their actual positions, right? So, I mean, it is interesting to me, the debate, say the tax debate, you know, the difference between a 35% marginal rate and a 39% marginal rate is the difference between socialism and capitalism. So you want to put aside the rhetoric and just recognize that across the entire political spectrum, everybody recognizes and is working within a framework in which government is going to be playing that kind of pervasive role. And of course, that's globally true. You cannot have a modern industrialized economy without government playing that kind of role. So there are disagreements about how deep it should be, how broad it should be, what forms it should take, but the role of government is a given. And of course, what that has meant for philanthropy has been, you know, that solving social problems of any sort requires deploying resources on a scale that's vastly greater than what traditional private charity and philanthropy could ever conceivably think of providing. I mean, if you think, again, just another quick statistic, last year I think all organized American philanthropy gave away about $40 billion, which is less than half of the K-12 budget for California, right? So, I mean, the scale of these things is just massively different, and we all need to turn to government, which means, of course, philanthropy has become very much about moving public policy. Now, I gather in this audience, you all have been there for a long time. But it's not necessarily pervasively recognized that way. And there is still a tremendous amount of philanthropy that's focused on direct services. We actually do direct services still at the Hewlett Foundation. It's all in the local community. But an important and increasing amount of philanthropic work is about moving public policy and also moving it in different ways. Because again, the traditional way that we thought about moving public policy might be either running test projects to show here's something that might work, or doing research in the hopes that maybe something would happen with it. And that's obviously still, again, an important role, but advocacy itself has become important and necessary. You cannot move government policy without actually trying to move government policy. Okay, so that is sort of the background. And again, it's even true for the people on the right who want less government, right? Or more private-public partnerships. Everyone pretty much is focused on affecting public policy. Now the problem is that the political dysfunction has become so extreme in the U.S. and particularly at the federal level that moving public policy at all, much less moving it in sensible directions, has become virtually impossible. Now, this is most true at the national level, and that's part of the reason that we are focusing on Congress. But it is moving downward. It is metastasizing out of Congress down into the state and local levels. And so it's a problem that is becoming increasingly bad and increasingly more local as we go along. Now, it's a problem, and I should say, on the one hand, it is a problem in and of itself. So I will talk to a lot of foundations, and it'll be like, well, we don't do that. That's not one of our areas. We do health or environment or whatever it is. And you want to say, okay, but this is really a rather important problem, and perhaps you ought to think about it from that perspective. But it doesn't matter. If you give me your area, whatever area you work in, this is a problem for you, right? Because you're not going to be able to achieve whatever policy outcomes you want because of the political dysfunction itself. Or if you can achieve it, it's going to cost you 20 times as much, it's going to take 20 times as long, and you're not going to get solutions that are much less desirable than you might get if you had a functional political process to work with. So it's a problem that cuts across fields and sectors because everything that government does, or as it turns out doesn't do, is effective. Now, I wrote all that, and I thought, actually, I probably hardly need to explain that to people who are doing grant making in the health field. Although the Affordable Care Act is really a great illustration in the sense that, so there was a reform, it happened. Of course, it happened because, if you think about it, a president who had just won a major election was able to get this one thing through on a squeaker with zero support from the other party. And then even more remarkably, in the aftermath of every other reform like that, because there had been plenty other reforms that happened early in the term of a new president, usually there was acceptance once the fight was over. And this is quite unique in the continued opposition to it across the board. So the aftermath, despite success, right, relative success, is itself kind of unique and symptomatic of the kind of political dysfunction that we're looking at. So we start with the idea that this is a problem that everyone needs to care about and work on together. It is, in a sense, I think, sort of the great, really, in some ways, the great challenge of our time. And I don't mean just for philanthropy, but really for the country as a whole, because solving this is a precondition to solving everything else. And as much as we need government to do things for us, if we can't get government to do them, there's nothing that we can achieve. So yes, I think climate change is a massive, massive problem. We put a huge amount of effort into it, but we can't really get anywhere on climate change without being able to move government. So we need to do that first. And when I went to the foundation, how do you think about what your foundation does? They actually asked me during the interviews, so what do you think you want to do? Do you think we need to change everything up? And I said, well, first I said, I have no idea. I'd have to be here for a while first to know. And I will say, if anybody came in and told you otherwise, you probably wouldn't want to hire them for that reason alone. From what I can tell on the website, the problems that the Hewlett Foundation works on all seem like great problems. Sort of, they're 5 or 6 of the 20 problems that can plausibly claim to be the 10 most important problems, if you know what I mean. But this one you should work on because in all of your areas you're working on public policy, and so in a sense this is supportive of everything else that the foundation does. And to be honest, I was a legal academic before this, and these issues had really been what all of my academic career had been about, so the chance to actually work on them was a big part of the reason I was interested in moving to the foundation and being able to actually do something about them instead of just write about it. Okay, so what is the problem though? Right? What is it that's wrong or has gone wrong to make our democratic process so dysfunctional? And here you get into a really interesting public debate because there's a pervasive sense that something is wrong, and people sort of talk as though they're all agreeing about that, but if you actually parse what people are saying, there are very different arguments being offered for what the nature of the problem is. And it's pretty disparate, but if you analyze it all pretty carefully, they fall largely into 3 different groupings. So a big portion of the complaints about what's wrong with the political process are really focused on participation. That we've got too few people participating, or the wrong people participating, or the wrong people not participating, that we need to do something about that. And you see this reflected in arguments about the voter ID laws or voting rights, voter registration problems, disenfranchisement of various groups, and so on. And with the assumption that if we could just solve that problem, if we could just get everybody participating, then the democratic process would be working in some way. A second batch, I resist using the word bucket. I hate that. I don't know why. It's like we're going to do deep dives into buckets. The second area falls under the idea of corruption. The political system has been corrupted, and this is really the focus on money in politics and campaign finance. And the problem is that a small group of wealthy special interests have controlled the process, and that's what we need to solve. And if we could just solve that, then the whole problem would go away. And then the third area, which is the one that we focus on, and I'll explain why in a minute, is the idea of polarization. That the system has become polarized, and that's where the lockup is. And by polarization, what we mean is that there's been a kind of sorting so that the 2 political parties, which used to overlap, the Democrats have become more consistently liberal, the Republicans have become more consistently conservative, but that also within each of those parties, not only is there that, but they're also narrowing, right? So you've got much less diversity both between and within each of the parties in terms of their ideological views. And I will say there is a view out there that no, it's really the Republicans, they're worse, there's more of it there. Actually, it's not true. If you actually look at what the social science data shows you, the movement within the Democrats and the movement within the Republicans is roughly equal in these terms. Now, there is a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, but it's not the degree of polarization. It's largely the tactics that the different parties have been willing to deploy. And even that is somewhat misleading, because most people only started looking at this after Obama's election. And it is true that the Republicans in Congress have been much worse under Obama than the Democrats were under Bush. But of course, the Democrats under Bush were actually worse than the Republicans were under Clinton. And the Republicans under Clinton were actually worse than the Democrats, and so what we've really been seeing is a downward spiral with whichever party doesn't control the executive pushing the tactics still farther. So, as I say, our view is we need to focus on political polarization, not because the other 2 things aren't problems, because they are problems in and of their right, but for 2 large reasons we think polarization has to be the place to start. So first, the solutions to this problem themselves will require government action. The election systems are all pervasively regulated, both nationally and at the state and local level, and a lot of the changes that are necessary are going to require revamping laws and regulations and schemes that are established by law or can only be changed by law. And of course, one of the effects of the polarization is gridlock, which means you can't move government action, which means unless we solve that one, we're not going to be able to get solutions to things like campaign finance, voter registration, whatever those problems are. So we need to solve polarization. Second, in truth, my view is the problems of political participation, lack of participation or distorted participation, and money in politics, those are not new problems. Those have always been features of the American political system, and it's even arguable that they're worse today than they have been in the past. I'm happy to talk about that if people want to. But the fact is they've at least always been there, and yet we managed to govern ourselves tolerably well to very well with those. It really, the change, the thing that's new is the political polarization. And that's what's producing the gridlock. So our view is not that we don't want to deal with those other problems, but that we need to start with a focus on polarization, which, as you'll see, does require addressing some of those issues, but with a different focus. And that we need to focus on that first, solve that, and then we can begin to address all of the other problems that have been produced as a result of government's inability or unwillingness to act. So our goal as we went into this was, what polarization has done is make it impossible for government action. And the reason it's impossible for government action is it's not that, in the past there was some consensus on what we should do about stuff. There's always been divisions, but there was an ability and willingness by members of Congress to negotiate and compromise, and a willingness on the part of the population to accept those compromises. And so our goal is, what can we do to restore the ability for members of Congress to negotiate and compromise with each other? And the reason we called it the Madison Initiative, that actually started out as a kind of joke. Initially we were going to call it the Democracy Initiative, and then our friends on the left came and said, you can't call it the Democracy Initiative, we just started a Democracy Initiative. This is the thing that the Sierra Club, the NAACP, and I think it's the SEIU, started to push a whole set of reforms. So then we said, okay, we'll call it the Democratic Process Initiative. And our friends on the right said, you can't call it the Democratic Process Initiative because that sounds too much like it's about the Democratic Party. So jokingly, I said, why don't we call it the Madison Initiative? And the reason I thought it was a joke was that's not going to mean anything to anybody. Which is why my staff said, that's a great idea, let's call it the Madison. We can't alienate anybody with that. But the reason I put it out there is, if you actually understand American constitutional and democratic theory, the idea of a Congress that will compromise and negotiate is the heart of it. Right? It is actually the core premise on which the Constitution and American Republic is built. And that was because, the notion was, we're going to create a large republic. This had not been done. That is, say, a government in which power derives from the people, not from orders or monarchs or whatever, and that is by design incredibly large and diverse, with tons and tons of interests and people with different beliefs and passions and interests and ideas about what should be done. And the only way that's going to work is if we can then structure the system so that we'll mediate those views through a system of representation in a Congress where people will come together and forge the necessary compromises and negotiations. That's the core value that was always understood as necessary to motivate the Constitution. So that's the focus. And then as we thought it through, we thought, nah, how do you do that? We actually started with, we'll do it for everybody. We ended up focusing on Congress, as I say, partly because our view is the problem is metastasizing down from there. But partly also, I think of Congress as, do you know what a cover species is in conservation law? Like the sage grouse. We work on protecting the greater sage grouse in the Southwest, because if you can protect the greater sage grouse, the steps that you had to take will mean that you have protected the whole ecosystem. It's just the place of that species in the ecosystem. And Congress is similar. If we can what we would need to do in order to actually produce compromise and negotiation in Congress will have effectively addressed much of the rest of the political system. So we can have a focus and hopefully work it out from there. But there are a couple of unique features in terms of how we're going to do this work as we go along. And there's two core premises, which I think are really relevant, particularly in speaking to an affinity group that is working in a particular area. So first, if we're going to solve this problem, we have to separate it from any particular policy agenda. Right? This is not about. So we have agendas. We have a climate agenda, we have a conservation agenda, we do reproductive health and abortion. We have all sorts of agendas in all of our other programs. This one is not about making those successful, right? That's a really important wall to build and insist on at all times. And for anybody who wants to do this work, if you make this about the reason we want to reform the democratic system is so that we can achieve success on this set of policies that we have, well, you just exacerbate the polarization. Right, there's a whole body of scholarship in the political science world that the problem here is income inequality. And if you just solved income inequality, you would solve political polarization. Now, first, I think that's probably analytically wrong. But in any event, if we come out and say, we know the way we're going to solve political polarization is redistribute wealth, Okay, we're done, right? We're never going to succeed that way. So we don't want to approach the problem in a way that will actually exacerbate it in going about it. And I will say, one of the things we've encountered, there's a false belief, this is true both on the left and the right, but it is particularly true among progressives, that progressives really have the majority. Right? The country really believes in the things that we do, and we're just being blocked. So what we need to do, what you funders should be doing, we get this all the time, is you just need to help us beat the other guys. And once we beat them, then we can put our policies in place, and all will be great. The way we interpret yesterday's, or day before yesterday, I guess now, election is really yet one more refutation of that. The fact is, the Republicans won, 31 governorships? Those are statewide elections, 31, the House, and believe me, it is not a product of gerrymandering. I'm happy to talk about that as well. There's just no way not to say this is a country in which we are actually just genuinely divided. And it's not, even if it's not false consciousness. It's like, yeah, all those people, they keep voting for the Republicans. They just don't understand what's in their own best interests. Well, that might be. But again, a premise of democratic government is not that. You can't approach it that way, right? People have to be treated as individuals who make their own decisions. That is another core premise of self-government. And so the fact is, for whatever reason and in whatever ways, we live in a country in which there are just really genuine divisions. And we're pretty evenly divided as it is. And so again, you can't go at this thinking that the solution is just to beat the others. It's like two boxers punching out in the middle of the ring, and they're just nobody's going to win. They're just bruising each other more and more. The second premise that we bring into this, which really follows from it, is that we need to do this in a way that is explicitly politically neutral, right? So again, we are not going to succeed in this work without we're not going to get support from either the far left or the far right, but we're not going to succeed in this work unless we get support from essentially the center left to the center right. It's going to have to be a coalition of people within that whole space. And as long as you continue to insist that what this really is about is advancing our substantive agenda, you're just not going to get that support. The way we like to talk about it is, it's like baseball. By the way, I'm not a big baseball fan. I grew up in Chicago. It's just impossible to be. I don't know how people do it in Chicago. That's another story. They broke my heart when I was 11 years old, the Cubs did. Anyway, so I won't use that. I'll tell you, so I hate both the Red Sox and the Yankees, but this seems to resonate for people. So I might root for the Red Sox, you might root for the Yankees. Whenever the Red Sox are playing the Yankees, I want the Red Sox to win, you want the Yankees to win. That's fine. But there also are these rules of the game. And we ought to be capable of sort of putting aside our desire to win when we play each other and saying, okay, but what are the right rules of the game so that when we play each other, it will work? And that's really what this work is about. So it's not about then let me twist the rules of the game so that the Red Sox can win more, right? That's just not it's wrong as well as not a recipe for success. So you can think about it as, to the extent that you do care about your substantive agenda, this is a way to an indirect rather than a direct approach. Right? This is not direct grant making to get our agenda in place. This is indirect in creating a system and an environment in which it will be possible for us to do it, because we can't do it now. And as I say, that's equally true whether you're on the left or the right. Or you can think about it as a long-term, short-term problem. Right? This is not letting the short-term desire to have a particular set of policies implemented get in the way of recognizing that we need a system that will work well in the long term, and having enough faith in our ideas and beliefs that if we can straighten the system out, we'll do reasonably well. And if we don't, then the problem will not be the system, it will be our ideas and the way we're pressing them, or maybe we're even wrong, God forbid. Right? But it is ultimately having faith in your positions to win in a properly constructed democratic process, and recognizing that the democratic process in itself is an important thing and something that should be supported by everybody. Okay, so how do we do this? Now, I should say, we have some ideas starting out about where are the levers to push. We don't think it would be beyond presumptuous to think that we're going to fix Congress, right? But we do think there are, as I say, a couple of levers that we can push that if some other things break our way, might actually have a strongly beneficial contribution to make to that. And the other kinds of things that need to break our way, we view as happening. right? The public itself is becoming increasingly aware of the need to do something. It's happening both within each of the parties and so on. So a lot of the background cultural forces and desires to actually take some action are there. And the question is, where are the places where we can create space for this? So preliminarily, we're looking at 3 areas in particular to start, although, as you'll see, that's not really what this is about. But the 3 areas that we're looking at are, first, rules in Congress itself. There have been changes in the rules in Congress that have taken place over the past 30 years. And the polarization problem, you can actually trace its roots back to the progressive era, but strongly, at least, back to the early 70s. There's a cultural story, which is one of the reasons we were able to get through this, was you had lots of conservative Democrats and lots of liberal Republicans, and the civil rights laws opened the door for Nixon to push a wedge strategy. And once all the conservatives in the South realized that they were actually Republicans and became Republican, and then they drove the liberal Republicans out of the Republican Party. So now we've got 2 neatly sorted parties. That's absolutely true. But there also were institutional changes that have been taking place all across the way, and a lot of the rules in Congress have made it harder, right? They've over-empowered leadership so that committees, where it used to be one of the places where compromises could be forged, no longer can do so. There have been changes in things like the roll call, the filibuster. They changed the filibuster, not the same filibuster, in ways that make it much easier to use than it used to be, and so it's become something other than what it historically was. My favorite example of this is roll call rules. They used to do roll call rules by voice vote in the House. Now they record them. That's given then each of the parties an incentive to force votes on things simply to get people on the other side on the record, which you can then use against them. Once they've done that to me, I'm going to do it to them, and everything begins to spiral down. So there's a whole suite of rule reforms that we think can help. They're not going to solve the problem, but at least they can create the institutional space if other things fall into place to do so. Second area in which we think there's lots of room for improvement are primary elections, but not in the way that most of you do. So, for instance, most of the reforms that are being talked about for primary elections, there is really good social science evidence, are either irrelevant or counterproductive. California, we enacted the top 2 primary, and everybody's like, see, look how well California is functioning now. California is functioning pretty well, but that's mostly because the Democrats got a supermajority. The top 2 primary, it's too soon to get much evidence out of California, but they've been doing it in Washington State and Louisiana for a long time, and we have tons of elections in which to show whether it works or not, and the answer is it almost never makes a difference at all. And the reason it doesn't make a difference is because turnout in primaries is something like 7 to 10%. And the 7 to 10% at the 2 political extremes are turning out, and so they're favoring candidates at the political extremes. And at that point, it doesn't matter whether it's top 2 or not. In the vast majority of elections, you're going to end up with the same Republican and the same Democrat, and they're going to be to the left and to the right of the rest of the district because of who voted in the primary election. By the time you get to the general election, it's a choice between 2. It's the primary that turns out to be key. And it's even worse in the states that use the old convention system or caucus system, where you have an even smaller percentage of people at the extreme of the party turning out and picking the candidates. And so you get well, I'm not going to name names because I'm being taped here. So we think a really useful reform would be to figure out ways to increase voter turnout in primaries and get that 7 up to something like 30%. And to do that, now the usual way you increase voter turnout is you scare voters or you get them angry. So those are not useful strategies for this purpose because that polarizes them. So the question is, can we increase voter turnout, say by lowering the cost of voting in primaries, making it easier to vote in primaries? We're not sure yet. We're doing experimentation to figure out, but that we think could make a big difference. And it's, by the way, primaries are also the reason why gerrymandering is irrelevant. So if you line up the districts from the most competitive to the least competitive, the theory would be that in the really competitive districts, the Democrats or Republicans will be more in the center, and they're not. There's essentially no difference in the ideological leftness of the Democrats or rightness of the Republicans from least to most competitive districts, and that's because the primary elections and the low turnout there. So that's a second area in which we're focused. Third is campaign finance. So as I said, we're not focusing on this. The system is corrupt because a small number of interests have managed to buy everybody off, because a small number of interests have always managed to buy everybody off, and yet it seemed to work reasonably well. And the reason was because the small number of interests actually couldn't buy everyone off, because the campaign finance system really ran through the parties. It was party-centered financing. And the parties are big tents that are moderating forces, even today, although they're not what they used to be, but almost by definition, because they want to win, as opposed to just advance a particular idea and so on. So given the constraints, of what the Supreme Court has said and done, and the fact that everybody out there seems to think that we're stuck with what the Supreme Court has said, I don't. My actual academic career was explaining why the idea of judicial supremacy makes no sense, but I'll accept it for this purpose. It leaves relatively limited space to do much useful campaign finance reform. People who are focused on corruption want to go for, say, small donor laws, right? It's like, yes, let's get people, and they won't be beholden to the Koch brothers, they'll be beholden to millions or hundreds of thousands of people. And that's true, except, of course, again, from what we know so far, it's even more polarizing because the small donors tend to be even more polarized. And so from our perspective, that's not really the kind of reform that will help with the core problem. And we're looking, are there ways to re-strengthen the parties in the campaign finance system so as to restore their warehousing effect in moderating candidates all across the spectrum. Now, those are just preliminary ideas on our part of some places to start. The fact is we're approaching the whole process, a little differently than the Hewlett Foundation has typically, or at least over the last 10 years or so, approached its philanthropy. So as you know, we're out at one end of the spectrum on the strategic philanthropy spectrum, and the way we typically have done this is we'll define a very specific goal, and all of our grant making will be focused on achieving that goal, and you kind of put on blinders and just plow along. So you do a lot of research up front, figure out what you're going to do, define your benchmarks, and go for it. So that won't work for this kind of problem because we don't know enough. And so we are approaching it to again, use the jargon du jour, it's a fully emergent strategy, right? We're approaching it in the way that we're going to try a whole bunch of different things, see what works, and adapt and change it as we go along. Second, it took, as I say, a minimum of 40, 50 years to create this problem. We're not going to fix it in 5. So it's a 20 or 30 year process at a minimum, but I couldn't go to my board and say, okay, I want you to sign up for a 20 or 30 year project. So what we asked them to do initially is we said, give us 3 years. That's why it's $50 million over 3 years, $15 million a year with 5 at the end to either scale it up or down, depending on what happens in the first 3 years. And what we're going to do in these first 3 years is we're not going to move the needle on this. We're going to try and sort of see whether it's plausible, whether we can create or find or come and tell you that there are conditions that make it worth a longer investment. And it'll still be in 5-year chunks, but don't even sign up for this 3 years unless you're willing, if the conditions are appropriate, to think about a 20 or 30 year project, even done in smaller chunks. And what we're looking at really in the first 3 years then are really 3 things. One is there are a lot of research gaps. As I say, we discovered that much of the conventional wisdom is contrary to much of the political science, so those are not good solutions, but it doesn't follow that we have good solutions. So let's fund research and see if we can come up with some ideas that seem more plausible. Second, can we find grantees out there that are capable of executing on those? Is there a rich enough environment that exists or that we can help create to think that we can push those solutions? And then third, and most important, there is no way we're going to do this by ourselves, even if we kicked it up to $100 million a year. So can we find enough other funders who are willing to participate in this project to make it seem plausible that if everybody stays with it for enough time, we can actually move the needle on this? And so in 3 years, we'll come back and tell you, yes, we think there are solutions, yes, we think there are, or we can create grantees, and yes, there are enough partners in here to make it work. And that last point I want to mention, because the collaboration is critical, and it means more than just other funders who are working on this, because like any big problem, the problem is so big that unless there's some coordination, we'll all be like pulling in slightly different directions and so making no actual progress. So it has to be a collaborative process, not where everybody agrees we're all going to do the same thing, but where there's a fair amount of coordination on who's doing what, so we're not being redundant in our funding. Right now, if you look at the funding that's out there, the vast majority is on campaign finance reform, and then way overfunded, and then whole other areas are just being ignored entirely. So can we sort of smooth some of that out so that we're doing the kind of experimentation that's necessary across the board? Can we work together, because whether there's agreement or not on the strategic goals, if there's agreement on the tactics, we should still be able to work together. And can we persuade funders on the center right to do the same thing? So that, is a big part of this. And you guys probably know this. I mean, collaboration among foundations, this has been the biggest surprise to me, is just how hard it is. And it's weird because we're not competing, right? I mean, I had an easier time running Stanford Law School, developing cooperative arrangements with, Harvard Law School and Columbia Law School than I do with other foundations, even though we were competing, right? And I think there are reasons for it that are, worth grappling with. Part of it, so it's not, there's a little bit of ego, I suppose, but much less. I don't think it's that foundations want to be able to claim credit for everything they do. A big part of it is the decision-making within foundations is really dispersed. So in order to make something happen, you need the program officer, the program director, the CEO, and the board all to agree. And they all have different incentives. So if I'm a program officer, my president may want to do something, but if it's going to affect my budget or my ability to pursue this thing that I really care about, I may not want to do it so much. Or, you can run this, if I'm the program director, my program officer may want to do it and my CEO may want to do it, but if it's going to affect the allocation within my program, I may not want to do it. And so getting everybody aligned that way turns out to be pretty difficult. But, more profoundly, there just is no culture of collaboration among foundations. So it's also, I wrote a blog at one point, there's a concept in international relations theory, the concept of reciprocity is not unique to international relations theory, but they draw a distinction between what they call specific reciprocity and diffuse reciprocity. So specific reciprocity is where, okay, I'll do this, you do that, we see exactly what the exchange is. Because our interests line up perfectly, we can do it. Diffuse reciprocity is, okay, I'll do this because I know you're going to do something for me in the future. A lot of diffuse reciprocity makes specific reciprocity easier. It's why nations will extend most favored nations clauses to other countries without demanding it back, because they know they'll get something like that in return later on, and everybody is better overall. And there is really virtually no culture of diffuse reciprocity within the foundation world, which makes specific reciprocity difficult because everybody has their very worked out strategies and they don't want to depart from them. And so you have to say, let's have a little looseness around the edges here. Some of it is nobody has enough discretionary funding. So it's well, I could try this out, except that means I have to stop doing something else unless I have some extra funding that I can throw into this. So one of the things that we've done in all of our programs and in the president's discretionary funds, we've now put a chunk aside specifically for purposes of creating collaborative programs or projects with other foundations, just to begin to build it that way. And then some of it is not overly developing your strategies before you start. I think for all of you as well as for us, this really does reflect the challenge of our times, and it is something that everybody needs to address. It looks weird, right? Because it is not funded, for you guys, for instance, it's not funding health policy. It's funding other kinds of changes that will make it easier to get advances in health policy, although only if you can persuade the polity in an appropriate way. So it requires patience, it requires willingness to subordinate short-term interests for long-term interests, it requires willingness to experiment, it requires willingness to take heat. So we've already had some bumps. I don't know how many of you followed Mailergate, but this you're bumping up the edges here, because although their efforts themselves are not partisan, you're bumping up against partisan politics, and everything you do may have an effect, and the people who are affected care, and they're going to push back. And then lastly, it requires patience, and also patience. Let me stop there and just take whatever questions you guys want to ask.
So we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. So anybody want to take the lead?
I talked too long. I didn't mean to talk that long.
One of the things you didn't talk at all about is the knowledge of the voters. And particularly our generation grew up where you could watch ABC, CBS, or ABC News, and you might like one guy better than the other. Basically, it was the same news. Today, you only listen to the point of view, and then the Gen Xers sort of just listen to Jon Stewart. And so you never hear, which I do.
You're a Gen Xer, right?
I absolutely
So yes and no. So it depends on how you look at it. So first, you really made two different points. One is how much knowledge do people have, and two is how different is the knowledge they have relative to other people. The former I actually don't think is a big problem, and a lot of people who think, again, the solution is we need better informed voters. Actually, again, the system is premised on the idea that you have modestly informed voters and well-informed representatives. And then the voters are, so voters, and that's key, because again, once people get too well informed, they dig in on their positions and the space to compromise goes away. And it was always assumed people have lives. They shouldn't spend all of their life paying attention to politics. That's what you have professional politicians for. One of the other things that just drives me crazy is the notion that like, if I need heart surgery, I'm not going to go to some schmo on the street. I'm going to go to a trained heart surgeon. People don't treat politics like it is, which is a complicated profession. So we want professional politicians. We want moderately informed voters who have a sense of where they want to go, but are willing to trust people to forge the compromises that need to be forged. Now, the echo chamber thing, that is a big problem. And we don't have that's one of the areas where we don't have a solution. We started with the idea that, we need to find some way to recreate Walter Cronkite. And, in the days when there were 3 networks and 3 newspapers and everybody was roughly, and they were all kind of centrist and everybody was roughly on the same page. The market forces against that are so overwhelming that we know we can't do that. So yes, and we don't have good ideas. We have some ideas that we're experimenting with and hoping others will build on still more. I'll give you 3 of them. One is there is some capacity to build a partial top-down solution. You're not going to recreate the New York Times of old that everybody reads, but there are news outlets that have good reputations on the left and the right, that people trust what they do. The problem is most of them want to become the New York Times. In the parlance, they want to become destination sites. They want everybody to come to them. And we're trying to see if we can get some of them to think about a different model where they work the way they do so that the work they do is still respected on the left and right, but view themselves as distribution sites instead. So, just put it, instead of becoming the new New York Times, become the new Reuters, right? And make your stuff available so that outlets on the left and the right will pick it up. Bottom-up solution, I ran in accidentally at some sort of event to the guy who runs KQED in San Francisco. And it was interesting. He explained to me they do not view themselves as a radio station, and they do not view themselves particularly as public radio in the traditional sense because, yes, they run the NPR programming, but most people are going to computers for that. They view themselves as a producer of high-quality regional news. And they have not just a radio station, they have 2 TV stations and a website. And between those platforms, they're touching 50 to 60% of the Bay Area population on a daily basis. So you could imagine a network of high-quality local news organizations like that all around the country that just share their stories freely when they have something that's of greater than local or regional interest. So that's a sort of possibly beginning bottom-up interest. The last solution is, and this is an interesting thing, the echo chamber network might be being a little exaggerated. A lot of the social, I don't know, how many of you are on Facebook? Yeah, okay. I'm on Facebook. I never post anything, and I never like anything, because it's like, oh my God, who needs that? But I friend anybody with whom I have a mutual friend. That's all it takes. So I have a really, really big friend network, and my friend network is really diverse politically. And they're all putting stuff on my news feed all the time. So the truth is I'm getting exposed to a vastly larger amount, an array of information. I get stuff from the right to the left and all around the middle. And so that if there's a way to enhance that approach for most people too, so that you're not only hearing the left wing or only hearing the right wing news and take on stuff. But, it's a big problem.
You mentioned the need to stay explicitly politically neutral and keep things separate from the program agendas. We heard earlier today that it's possible to be objective without being politically neutral. And I'm wrestling with that. We're just stepping into the policy arena.
Oh, I'm sure it's possible to be objective without being politically neutral, but for this work that won't be effective because you may think you're being objective, but the person who doesn't agree with you won't, right? And so all that is another way of saying, but I'm right, and you're wrong, and here's the evidence. And again, it's just as a practical matter, we're not going to make progress on this as long as we approach it that way.
So how are you doing that?
So we're not doing that. Like I say,
No,
what
how
we're...
are you doing that? How are you staying politically neutral?
So by staying, this is about no substantive issues except for democratic reform itself. Now, then where you get into a problem is democratic reforms themselves often have a valence. So, for instance, we think we need better voter registration systems. Conservatives are concerned with voter fraud and want voter IDs. Progressives say there is no voter fraud, this is just a sham in order to exclude voters. There are a whole bunch of answers, right? So one is, okay, maybe, but right now we actually have no evidence that, and we're just starting to get some about how many people are not voting, being kept away, whether they would have voted anyway, whether it would have affected the outcome. So maybe we should get a little less bent out of shape about that and instead work with them to produce voter ID rules that actually work for people. So they use voter IDs everywhere else in the world, right? It's not, you can't take a position like voter ID is bad itself because it has these effects. If it has these effects, it's because we have bad voter ID rules. So if it's really IDs you want, then let's figure out a way to have government proactively provide the IDs. And then we can solve that so we can have both. So we look for solutions like that, you know, across the array of things where we can just, it's the same. I said to the funders when we had a big funder and grantee convening, I said, look, we're trying to create a system where people in Congress can compromise and negotiate. If we can't do it ourselves, then how are we supposed to have it happen in Congress? So you have to do the same process.
You mentioned early on, in the past, there was a consensus, but there was willingness for our leaders to negotiate and compromise, and people's tolerance of politicians compromising. And
There was not a consensus. There never was a consensus.
So my question is, it feels like a chicken and egg thing. Are our politicians being so dramatic on one side or the other because that's what their constituents are demanding of them? And how are you going to change those 7 billion people?
Yes. So the answer is, again, there's been some recent, the Pew Research survey, which we funded because we wanted a baseline. So we had them. They've been doing it for a long time. We had them. They wanted to, and we were happy to do it, expand the survey quite a bit, make it larger and more comprehensive. And so what we know is there is actually still, the extremes are bigger than they used to be. That's the metastasizing down. But it's still the case that probably about 75% of the American public is pretty open and middle-ish. The problem is the structures of politics have changed so that it's the extremes that are in control, and the politicians are forced to respond to them, whether it is through the primary system, through the finance system, through the leadership in Congress and the way they're structured. So those are the pieces we want to change so that actually, right, and we need to do this relatively quickly because more and more people are getting polarized. So it's still a really large percentage of the public that's in the middle, but it's, and I will say this, I think when we have these debates, people tend to take for these are problems, but American democracy can't actually fail. We're not talking about I would not say that, right? The stakes here really are that high. There is no reason to assume that we are inherently going to avoid the fate of every other Republican form of government in history. We have to tend to it ourselves. And these are the kinds of things that tear republics apart or have historically. So it's really important to act on this now. Before it really is too late.
Peter, maybe less.
Question, we hear a lot about gang of 8, gang of 6. Have you done some analysis, because it feels like you're going with the institutional approach? Are the volume and quality of ideas, say on immigration reform, because we hear about bipartisan efforts within Congress, have you done some analysis, is the volume declining of those sorts of groups? Are the quality of ideas declining? Or truly is, there are lots of good ideas sitting within Congress that could be bipartisan that aren't percolating through?
So we haven't done anything systematic. I mean, it's much more, that kind of analysis is much more episodic, but the sort of conventional wisdom, which does make sense to us, is there are fewer efforts. It's not the quality of ideas that are worse, although the space available to produce the compromises is smaller, there is less of it, but more importantly, when those groups get together, they fail more often than they used to in the past, and that's because of over-controlled by leadership, excessive transparency. We think earmarks were a great thing, right? Getting rid of earmarks was a really, really bad move. At the cost of 0.1% of the annual budget, we were able to make things happen. And in this is one of the other things that we have to struggle with. We don't know how to do this. Democracy isn't pretty. The old sausage making thing is true. And if what you strive for and insist on is this kind of pristine version that has never existed anywhere functionally, then you're just cutting off your own nose to spite your face. So we need to, now we're not going to bring back earmarks. My view is we can bring back their equivalent in other ways, but we need to have room for people to buy people off. I mean, it's like, how do you make a deal, right? You have to make it worthwhile for somebody. You have to give them a stake. And by the way, it's not like earmarks went away, right? They just shifted from Congress to the executive. The earmarks have to be made. So all you did was shift them. Why not do them in Congress and make legislation feasible? Stuff like that. So can we take one more?
One more. Billie? Okay.
Yeah, I'm from Health Affairs Journal. I just, from what I've read, one thing that has changed is that people in Congress do not get to know each other as friends and socialize. I think one of the examples was Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan were
Yeah.
friends or something like that. What happened there? And they just don't want to know anybody, the other party?
Yeah.
It's just like blinders on?
So again, that's a 30-year process that has taken place, and it's absolutely true. So Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan just go out for drinks like most nights at 6. They'd fight and then go out for drinks at 6. So again, that's been a combination of things. Spending 50% of your time fundraising. The notion that the problem with Washington is insiders and we need outsiders. So now if you're going to be in Congress, you can't stay here. You have to, so nobody lives here anymore, which means they don't socialize here. They have 3-day work weeks, right? And they go back home right after that. When they're here for the 3 days, then they're spending most of their time either fundraising or getting what little business they can't get done, which is with their co-party. And then within, they've also changed a lot of the institutions. So now the gym is the only place where members actually meet each other. They have separate lunches. They have separate briefings on the facts. They used to do those things jointly. We are doing, part of our rules in Congress piece does include a rebuilding bipartisan relationships piece, but the truth is at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do given those circumstances. We actually need our representatives to live here. That's why I'm the idea of a 5-day work week where you could create more opportunity, all that stuff needs to happen also because, it's not like knowing each other will solve the problem. It's one of those things though that will ease it. So that if you don't think of the guy on the other side as your enemy or evil, but actually have an understanding of that person, obviously that works. All right, thank you.